now it's time to address the how. How are we going to make it? And the rest of the day will be mostly centered around 4 sessions, 2 now and 2 after lunch. The 4 sessions are basically addressing how to reach the main goals that we all have in mind. There are big challenges, mostly technological challenges, as was emphasized in the introduction, and the names or the areas, the general areas are power generation and distribution, transport, industrial processes, and cities. The first 2 in the morning. So the session that will be now moderated by Manfred has the title of Low Carbon Power Generation and Distribution.
So, the moderator of this first panel on Hafner, who is the coordinator of the Future Energy Research Program at Fondazione Eni Enrico. And, well, Manfred is already at the stage, together with 4 panelists. Supriyatna. So, I will leave the floor to the speakers.
Can you have the slides on, please? The slides?
Yes.
No, that's not the right. The first slide. Yes. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for having invited me here. This is a session on low carbon power generation and distribution. We have 4 wonderful speakers after me, and let me just try to go a little bit, to be a little bit holistic, and then the speakers, they will dig into the details. So first, as Jeff said this morning, after 27 years of climate policy, we have not delivered. Yes, you may claim the situation would be much worse if we didn't have had all these climate debates, but the truth is, the bottom line is that the emissions have gone up all the time, and even the last 3 years, every year we have added about 0.5 billion tons, which is the equivalent of total international aviation every year, which we have just added. So we are going the wrong direction. And when we look at the problem, we can see that in reality we have 2 types of scenario approaches. We have the exploratory scenarios, we have some people call them most likely scenarios, or the trends where we are going. We can see that these trends are bending, but they may be highly plausible, but they are totally unsustainable. On the other side, we have what we call the normative scenarios. These normative scenarios, they are backstepping scenarios. We start with a goal where we want to get, and we work backwards. These are theoretically feasible, but seemingly implausible. So our role here, and the task which we have worked on in the Roadmap 2050 with Jeffrey Sachs and Paolo Carnevale and many other people, was to try to figure out how to move from these exploratory scenarios to the normative scenarios. Of course, in theory, it's easy. We need to decouple energy demand from GDP. Yes, we need GDP, but we don't need more energy. And then we need to decarbonize the remaining energy mix. Decarbonizing, part of it goes through an electrification and a zero carbon electric part. We know that energy transitions have always existed. This is 200 years of energy. We have had biomass, and then it was replaced by coal, it was replaced by oil, gas, and so on. We have a new type of renewables nowadays, and nuclear. But these energy transitions, they took time, and we are running out of time. We are running out of time. And then we have, from time to time, some disruptive changes. Let's look at these 2 pictures. These are pictures, Fifth Avenue, Easter Parade in New York, on the left-hand side in 1900. There was no one single international, internal combustion engine car. And on the right-hand side, so only horse carriages, 1900. And 13 years later, the same picture, the same avenue, Easter Parade, only cars driven with internal combustion engines. Now, we may be again at such a turning point. When we look at the mobility sector, when we look at the automotive industry, how they are now investing into electromobility, it may not take 13 years, it may take 30 years, but that's fine. We are changing something. Of course, digitalization will change our lives and allow for further decarbonization. We have this top-down approach, which is decarbonization, which is policy-driven, but we also at the same time have a bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach being technology-driven, market-driven, digital. And then we have decentralization, which is being promoted thanks to these new technologies. And all of these is going to change fundamentally the way we are producing, we are consuming, we are transmitting electricity. Smart grids and Internet of Things are going to change fundamentally the way we produce, we consume electricity. We are going to go from unidirectional flows from big power plants to our households to multidirectional electricity systems with prosumers, consumers and interacting thanks also to data flows and electricity flows using the same wires. We know that renewable energies have fallen in costs tremendously, dramatically over the last decades and over the last decade, in particular solar PV over the last decade. And this will continue, but there will be others. There is offshore wind. Look, watch out for offshore wind. There are very important things happening as far as offshore wind is concerned. And all of these renewable energy sources, many of these which are non-dispatchable, they need flexibility. Maybe in the future, electricity by itself will not be worth very much, the kilowatt hour, but flexibility will have a high value. New business cases for flexibility. Flexibility options, there are many, and we are working on them, and we need to work on them. They relate to generation, which means dispatchable generation, demand-side management, international and regional transmission capacities, distribution, which means prosumers, consumers, and the flexibility which come from the customers, and storage. We used to have just pump storage, hydro pump storage. Now we are developing batteries which are not yet up to capacity, we will see that, but the big processes are being done. And then in parallel, we need to work, and we have sector coupling, power to heat, power to hydrogen, power to electric vehicles and back. Electricity storage, we need much more research into it. There is not one way of storing electricity. There are many ways depending on the needs, depending on system power ratings, depending on discharge time which we need. There are different solutions, but we need to have more research on those. We need better and cheaper batteries and a tremendous upscaling development. Costs have fallen, but not enough. Performances have increased, but not enough. There are still issues which relate to upscaling, market concentration, rare earth materials. Sector coupling, power to gas. When you have too much renewables, non-dispatchable renewables and not enough demand, well, you could just use this electricity, which doesn't cost anything or very little, and you produce, for instance, hydrogen out of electrolysis. And this hydrogen, you can also produce hydrogen out of biogas. Or you could even imagine using natural gas with steam reforming plus carbon capture and storage or pyrolysis to produce hydrogen. And all of this hydrogen can then be used in the economy for mobility, for industry, for heating, or back to power if we need power. It's a storage. Electricity we cannot store, it's difficult to store. Hydrogen we can easily store. Sector coupling, grid to vehicles and back to the grid. Carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use. We should not, I think, forget completely about this opportunity, which is very often not very much liked. The idea is either to store the CO2 in underground depleted gas fields or to use it and to mineralize it, for instance, which has a much better public acceptability, and therefore you can use it in building sectors and so on. The issue we have, it relates to upscaling, relates to costs, relates to public acceptability again. We also, since the idea is to get carbon neutral by 2050 and then carbon negative, and that it is not easy to decarbonize everything totally, we also need negative emissions. And so we have BECCS and DACs, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, direct air carbon capture and storage. The BECCS, the idea is you cultivate biofuels, therefore absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Then the biomass, you can produce electricity, so you get electricity, and the CO2 you produce, you store it under the ground. That's one way. The problem is that you need, you have a big high land use for it, but you can produce electricity and you are carbon negative. The second one, DACs, the idea is you capture the CO2 from the ambient air through chemical absorption, and then you store it underground. Here you don't need a lot of land, but you need a lot of electricity. You need a lot of energy. But if you imagine that electricity very often costs almost nothing because you have too much of it, because of a huge amount of wind and solar and less demand from time to time, you can do it relatively cheaply. Of course, all of this does not have any sense. All of these technologies do not have any sense if we do not also change the fuel mix. We need to get rid of the coal. In Europe, for instance, we are in Europe right now. In Europe, coal represents 1/4 of total electricity production and 3/4 of total emissions. And it does not make any sense, as we have done very often in Europe, to promote very strongly renewables and forget to shut down the coal mines and the coal power plants. This is bad for the climate, it's bad for the environment, and it's bad for human health. And this can be done, and it's not an issue of job losses. You can see here, I don't have time to elaborate this, it's peanuts. Pay for it, get rid of the coal, we don't need the coal. And I mean, if you have gas, replace it with natural gas, later on decarbonize natural gas, use renewables, but get rid of the coal. And these are my conclusions. A few words on governance as well, in addition to technology. First of all, we need to decarbonize. We need to have a zero carbon by 2050 and then negative, and we are running out of time. But it's very important. Of course, we need technologies, but also need to have the right governance. This means we need a just, inclusive, and holistic approaches to create ownership of all stakeholders. It cannot be that some people think it's done by the others, it's done by them up there, and we are missing out. We need to have ownership by everybody. Otherwise, we will have backlashes, we will have carbon leakages, and so on. We need to tackle the socio-economic issue and the international dimension of the energy transition. This implies people, companies, and countries. People, meaning we need to have policies which include the poor. Obviously, otherwise they will not be with us. We will need to create awareness through schools, through whatever, behavioral changes. Companies, public, corporate responsibilities. Countries, we need to have a convincing narrative, finding winning arguments for all. It cannot be that we tell Saudi Arabia or Russia that we are going away from oil and gas, and therefore they are dumped, they are finished. No. Maybe they can, Saudi Arabia, they can produce hydrogen out of solar. They have so much solar. Or in Russia, they can produce hydrogen out of natural gas. So there needs to be a narrative where everybody sees a win-win solution. And of course, the poorest countries, sub-Saharan Africa, they are not the problem. They can be given added flexibility. Market mechanisms alone seem not to deliver. We have seen that. So we may, in addition to them, we may need mandates and with pricing as accompanying measures. We need to create a competitive marketplace for innovation. This is very important. Provide public-private R&D for priority challenges, but then mandates for deployment. We eliminated all the incandescent light bulbs in Europe, not by increasing the market price of electricity by 50% or 100%, but through mandates. And the same we need to do with coal. And and of course, mandates do not mean picking technologies. Picking technologies never works. We need to mandate full fuel cycle, low carbon, for instance, vehicle standards, not electric cars. And then let the technologies compete. And of course, we may need to also seriously think about adaptation and how to help the poor countries along the process. Thank you very much. We will now continue our set of presentations. It is my pleasure to introduce Joan Herrera, who is the director of IDAE, the Instituto para la Diversificación y Ahorro de Energía, or in English, the Institute for Diversification and Energy Conservation. Joan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, all of us. Well, presently I have been director of IDAE, the Spanish agency, until September, and currently I am director of Environment and Energy of Ajuntament del Prat since September. Well, my intervention is proposed as a policy advisor, as a policy maker. I am going to speak about a person who has been leading the Spanish Energy Agency, but who is now leading a new urban agenda in El Prat de Llobregat. El Prat is a city close to Barcelona. We have a delta area, agricultural place, but we have the airport, the port, and big infrastructures in the city of Barcelona. I believe that everyone here can conclude that the main crisis of the 21st century is going to, it doesn't go, well, I will do without, yeah. Wait. The main crisis of the 21st century is going to be climate. This is humanity's main moral challenge. But we have to speak about how can we go from moral challenge to a political and economical opportunity. Do you think that our agenda is an obvious agenda? Can you see the demonstrations in Chile, in Ecuador, in Iran, in France against green tax? It's not an obvious agenda. Phenomena like Trump, Bolsonaro, the deniers, explain us that we know that is a moral challenge, but for so many people, it's not a political or economical opportunity. And obviously, it's very important the point of view of engineering. It's very important the point of view of economics. But it's very important how can we work with people to involve people in the transition energy and the transition against the climate change. In my point of view, the most important thing is to understand that countries, continents with a large energy dependence like Europe or Spain. In Spain, we have a 74% of the energy dependence. The challenge, the opportunity of energy transition is a political opportunity, an economical opportunity. And it is one of the keys if we want then people understand, involve with the fight against the climate change. Secondly, the second point that I would like to speak about urban agenda and photovoltaic generation. Throughout history, cities have been energy trains. You have here a picture of El Prat de Llobregat. El Prat is a small city in metropolitan Barcelona area with the airport, with the port, and without energy production. All our cities are drains and are drains, and that's the problem that we have to work. How can we do it? I think that we have to work about a new associative and shared framework. The local energy communities, the citizens' energy community, allows us to group consumptions, develop shared strategies on investment in demand management that had not been put forward until now. But this requires institutional action that groups consumers and allows collective investment in generation, but also in manageability of the generation and even in the necessary storage of energy. We need a new strategy for our rooftops and public spaces. We need strategies that share generation spaces and that make public spaces and peri-urban generation spaces green areas that are a mosaic of generation and green zone. Shades where the green is combined with photovoltaic cover should be part of the new urban planning strategy of the city. Thus, public space should be a space that reconnects with the planet, the city with the planet, also in terms of renewable generation. We can talk about cities, neighborhoods, buildings, zero emissions with gas in our cities. I live in a Mediterranean city with temperate temperatures. Should we take away the gas for buildings? I think it's a correct question if we speak about zero emissions cities, at least in the more temperate areas of the planet. We have the right to zero emissions, and it has to be translated into strategies for replacing gas boilers of individual with heat pumps that allow thermal uses to be replaced by electrification of which uses. We need digitized consumption, domesticization of household electric appliances, and it is not possible a massive growth of renewable without demand management, price signage that allows it, digitization and domotation of consumption, and without consumer aggregation. And to do that, we need an active point of view of administration and specifically of local administration. And obviously, we need to electrify mobility. The electrification of mobility is another key element of the energy transition in the city. Reducing consumptions means facing the first challenge of the city, to take the cars off the streets. Changing the mobility, and this is for the simple reason that mobility, motorized, individual, and carbonized, is the main factor of energy consumption in our major cities. As Deloitte's report presented in Spain shows that the states that in cities such as Madrid, transport represents more than 50% of the city's energy consumption. Or cities like Barcelona, where this consumption represents 62%. There is no urban transition without a change of mobility. Thus, the reduction of consumption, as well as the electrification of mobility, needs decisive action in our urban agendas to tax the use of vehicle, as well as its entry and circulation in through our streets. Today, private transport in the metropolitan area of Barcelona represent 24% of journeys. But instead, these same vehicles, which don't account to the greater part of the mobility, occupy 70% of the public space in the city. 24% of mobility, private transport, 70% occupying our public space. Poor mobility is not only a factor affecting health, but represents worse air quality and even major losses for the productive sector. There is therefore no urban commitment without a sudden change in mobility. And this means accompanying the model change towards moving around the city on foot, by bicycle, by public and collective transport. Last one, that means territory, before the last one, territory pact. We need engaged citizens in local energy communities. In turn, allows the new pact with the territory. Aggregate purchase of energy, investment in the development of renewable, the economic development of non-urban areas, and a new dialectic between countryside and the city. Can you imagine what happens in France if cities and countryside had another kind of dialogue between Paris and the countryside of France? We need the citizens that are living in the city be a key of the renewable generation and create jobs in the countryside. Last one. For urban change, we need administration as a driver. And it's very important. I believe that in this context, the administration, and particularly local administration, is a key player. Local ordinances or bylaws that facilitate not only self-consumption, but a strategy of buildings, neighborhoods, and near-zero consumption buildings, new urban qualifications that allow in peri-urban space the combination of green areas with renewable generation spaces, rethinking and planning shared space from perspective now and to the first time in history as a generation space, making municipal roofs the piece from which to start creating these local and citizen energy communities, defining energy storage space in urban transformation, even more so when battery prices are going down, proposing, planning, thinking ordinances or bylaws to take advantage of these roofs, encouraging aggregate energy purchases that allow for bilateral agreements with producers and renewable beyond urban reality, defining spaces and strategies of shared electric vehicles, which allows the abandonment of the individual combustion vehicle in favor of shared use of vehicles. I'm not saying the challenge is simple. I'm just saying that today it's cheaper, scalable, with shared technology, and to do that, we need urban administration as a driver and leading the change that we need in our cities. Thank you very much.